Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks, landing a familiar face out of the transfer portal. Former Florida State and Campbell edge rusher George Wilson committing to South Carolina. Now, a familiar face, I think, to a lot of South Carolina fans who follow this program pretty damn closely and have been following it for a very long time. George Wilson was a four-star prospect committed to South Carolina in the 2021 cycle, ended up flipping his commitment late in the process with the head coaching change at South Carolina. Twitch and length for a guy like George Wilson. Now, you look at George Wilson in his career at the college football landscape, spent his first 2 years at Florida State, didn't really get on the football field much, was a developmental edge rusher coming out of high school, decides to go to Campbell for the last 2 years, played some really solid football at the FCS ranks for Campbell, now making his way back up to the Power 4 level. George Wilson satisfies the depth that South Carolina was looking for in that edge rusher room. You know, George Wilson ain't coming into South Carolina to play 60 snaps a game. Like, you got your starting edge rushers headlined by Dylan Stewart. But Shane Beamer was very vocal that we got to get the numbers right. We got to make sure we are deep enough to withhold an SEC schedule in 2025, especially along the line of scrimmage. Now, what intrigues me the most about George Wilson is, even though this kid is going into year 5 of his college football career, there's some serious upside as a pass rusher. No, I think many South Carolina fans probably have their question marks about how good George Wilson can be against the run in the SEC. You know, 6'4", 230, probably soaking wet. Not the most physically imposing edge defender that you'll see, but he's got a lot of length and he's got a lot of twitch, and he has a deep pass rush, or a deep toolkit, you might say, of pass rush moves that he can go to. Went and buzzed him against West Carolina, because I know West Carolina has a guy that's going to be starting at Oklahoma this year at tackle. There are some intriguing aspects about George Wilson's game. Now, I don't think he's going to be a guy that plays a ton on first and second down, because I don't think he's going to be a great run defender in the SEC. But what made South Carolina such a dominant defense in the 2024 year? It was the ability to get after the passer. Now, replacing guys like Kyle Kennard and TJ Sanders on the inside, you still have Dylan Stewart. So you know South Carolina is still going to get after the passer, at least at a pretty dang high level. We're trying to make sure we can impact the quarterback the way we did in 2024. That's where I think George Wilson provides some value. And y'all know how I feel about Sterling Lucas. You know, coaching up these edge rushers and developing them the right way. I know he's a fifth-year senior that is probably not going to come into South Carolina and light it up the way that Kyle Kennard did. But at the end of the day, I look at George Wilson and say, it's rare that you can find guys that can contribute to your team in the spring transfer portal window. And I think George Wilson has that chance, you know, not as an every down pass rusher, not as an every down edge defender, but as a potential pass rush specialist. You look at him, Dylan Stewart, coming off the edge on third and longs. I think that can be dynamic for South Carolina. But at the very least, you're getting a guy that's coming off playing 800 plus snaps the last 2 years that you know can probably give you some solid reps at the edge defender position in 2025. Depth was always going to be the answer for South Carolina. You know, I don't think, unless they go out and land Bo Atkinson, there's not a ton of guys in the portal that are going to come in and start for South Carolina. But can we get guys that can give us 10 to 15 quality snaps a game? I think both Damon Clowney and George Wilson, those spring transfer portal additions South Carolina has made, I think those are guys that can do it for South Carolina. I think you got that one box checked with your edge defender depth. Now it's full court press to figure out the interior of this defensive line. Want to talk about where we sit with South Carolina? Before we get into it, as always, to the South Carolina fans, appreciate you guys. It been fun, you know, kind of putting our general manager hats on and talking about where South Carolina can go in the transfer portal, talking about some names that are generating some buzz. The amount of support y'all have shown the fellas has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Let's start with where we sit in terms of South Carolina's defensive front. Look, in the edge edge defender room, I think you're feeling pretty good, right? Dylan Stewart, one of the best in the country. Brian Thomas, a guy that to me is probably one of the most underappreciated, not maybe not underappreciated, but underrated players on South Carolina. Like played a lot and played good football for South Carolina in the 2024 year. Just didn't get that much media buzz because you had Dylan Stewart and Kyle Kennard. Dylan Stewart, Brian Thomas, you feel really good about. You're hearing all the right things from a guy like Desmond Yu going into 2025. Like we knew Desmond wasn't going to be a guy that was going to play year one, year two. Like he needed some serious development, but he's now physically looking the part. Sounds like he's coming together as a football player. Those three names you like: Damon Clowney, Jataeus Greer, now George Wilson. You have Jaylen Brown. Not really sure the extent of his injury that he suffered in spring, but I'm guessing that's why South Carolina went out and added two guys that have played a decent amount of football. I think you're sitting there and saying, all right, we feel pretty good about the edge defender room heading into 2025. Now it's all hands on deck to figure out the middle of that defensive line. At least one body, I think, is necessary. Two bodies is probably ideal. And look, Shane Beamer has showed us, like, they're going to be patient. They're going to let the market kind of develop for these names and then kind of pick through the names that are available. What he's showing us is, hey, we're going to go out and address the positions that we are concerned with, right? Edge defender was a position Shane Beamer talked about. Went out and grabbed two guys. I would expect one or two big bodies in the middle of that defensive line to come to South Carolina. Now you're just trying to figure out what kind of players those are going to be. Where it starts is if you want to get a difference maker, if you want to get an elite player in the middle of this defensive line, you're going to have to shell out a lot of money. And we'll see if South Carolina is willing to do that, because you look at the landscape right now. Texas has been hunting for interior defensive linemen. Georgia has been. Ohio State has been. Like there's a lot of heavy hitters across the country that want that position, along with South Carolina. But there are also a few names that I think give South Carolina what they're looking for, and that is depth. To me, the biggest concern for South Carolina here is, do we have enough SEC quality players? I think we know we have one with Brown Ludindy. I think we know we have with Monkel Goodwin, who sounds like he had a phenomenal spring practice. Nick Barrett can play. Outside of those three, is Xavier Hardy going to be ready from JUCO to the SEC? Devontae Miles making the jump from the MAC to the SEC. Those are some guys we have some question marks about. You probably want that number to get to at least 6. In South Carolina, probably sitting around 4 right now. We'll see what comes down the road. I think it's clearly a position South Carolina wants to address. Now we're going to find out what body South Carolina chooses to bring in. But I'll say this. I'm a fan of South Carolina being patient. I think it's frustrating sitting here still having the question marks about it. There are some teams that are just throwing a ton of money around. Like from what you heard about a guy like Murad Watson at Texas, from Syracuse to Texas, it was there were 2 commas. That's at least what it sounded like. Two commas in that deal from Murad Watson to come to Syracuse or to go to Texas. South Carolina's being patient, kind of letting the chips fall a little bit. I think they'll go out and get a guy they like. We'll see who that guy is over the next couple of days and weeks. Wanted to hop on and talk about George Wilson, who, again, I think can provide some pass rush juice to this football team. I don't know how good he will be against the run in the SEC. There is some pass rushing chops to this kid that I think excites Shane Beamer, Sterling Lucas, and the South Carolina team. We'll pause it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.